I am going to show you how to make smocking in dress, in the frocks. Smocking is done on plain material where we gather the material and make pleats and work the embroidery, for which we need to place dots on the material. We get iron-on smocking paper in the craft stores. You can buy that and place the iron-on transfer smocking paper and iron it on the wrong side. So, you will get the impression like this. Basically, we need 1 centimeter space, dots placed just 1 centimeter apart or even smaller depending on the size of the embroidery we are going to make, the smocking we are going to make. After transferring the dots on the material, we need to gather the dots, for which we take any cruel needle, single strand, any thread. It could be even machine thread, not necessarily you have to take embroidery thread, you can take even machine thread, single strand, and start gathering. Just make running stitch. You don't have to knot up the end of the thread. Start from the very first dot, running stitch, gather each dot. Go into each dot, take it out in the next dot, down, up, running stitch. Same way the next row. Each row is done in the same way. Every row till the required length should be, we have to do the running stitch like this, and finally gathered. See that every row the thread comes up in the same side. The space is given in the same row. The row should be maintained. If you do it in the opposite, see in between, next row if you do if the thread comes here, the gathering will not be even. This is the way you have to maintain. The thread comes up in the same row and the thread goes down in the same row. This should be followed. And for doing the smocking, supposing you are doing a baby frock or whatever, to whatever length we are going to do the smocking embroidery, we need to take 3 times the length of the material. Supposing we are going to make the embroidery to a length of 12 inches, we need to take 36 inches. The material length should be 36 inches, 3 times the required length of the embroidery. After making running stitches to the length we require, see the both edges, after making running stitches along the dotted lines, both the edges, we do not have to knot up these edges. The thread should be hanging on either side. Now we just need to pull the threads together. Just pull the threads on either side. You can see the pleats getting formed. Pull the threads from this side as well. You can see the fine pleats have been formed. You can even pull each thread individually. We are going to do the smocking stitches on these pleats. You can see the gathered running stitch in between each pleat. Just make it tight. On a plain material, we iron the dots and gather the pleats like this. We could use even dotted material for baby frocks, etc. We can use dotted material in which we do not have to iron on the dots. We can just gather the dots, and we can use even checked material. We can use checked material like this. We can gather the checks. We can do the running stitch in each square. We can do the running stitch in each square, or every alternate square depending upon the size of the pleat we need. And gather the pleats. We are going to work on these pleats. Now I will show you the stitches used in the smocking on the pleats. Most of the stitches used in the smocking embroidery are from freestyle embroidery. First I am going to show you cable stitch. Just take from one end from below. Cable stitch, you just have to take a small stitch on top of the pleat. The thread goes to your right. Take a stitch on the next pleat. The thread comes to your left. Take another stitch on the next pleat. The thread goes to your left, right. Take a stitch on the next pleat. Thread goes to the left. Take a stitch on the next pleat. Thread goes to the right. Take a stitch on the next pleat. Thread goes to the left. Take a stitch on the next pleat. Thread goes to the right. We are just doing one stitch in each pleat. In every pleat on the reverse we are taking a stitch from reverse. Take a stitch. Take a stitch down to up, down to up, down to up, down to up, down to up. See, thread automatically goes to the right. Take a stitch. Thread goes to the left. Take a stitch. Thread goes to the right. Take a stitch. Thread goes to the left. We are just doing one row of stitches in each pleat, but you will find 2 rows of stitches. Just one single row of stitches we are just taking like that, but you can find 2 rows of stitches. You can see the curve this side and the curve that side. This is called cable stitch. Cable stitch in smocking embroidery. Next we will learn how to make stem stitch in smocking. Again come from below. Take a stitch in the next pleat. Maintain the thread to one side of the stitch. Take a stitch in the next pleat. Maintain the thread to one side of the stitch. This is same as cable stitch. Cable stitch, when you take a stitch, the thread automatically goes to the right. In cable stitch, we just used to leave it like that. So we got 2 curved stitches. Now in stem stitch we are just maintaining the thread to one side of the stitch. Take a stitch, the thread goes to the right but maintain it to the left side. Take a stitch, always maintain the thread to one side of the stitch. This is called stem stitch. Since this is a checked material, you have squares. Here you can see the highlighted color. You can just go straight on top of that. So without any drawing or anything, your line keeps going straight. In case you are not using a checked material or dotted material, it will be plain. You might tend to go in a diagonal, the stitch might go in a diagonal line, it might not go straight, in which case you can just see the gathered stitch inside. See, I have done the gathered stitch in a contrast color. You can see that. You can keep that as the marking. So now you can follow, in case you are doing a plain material, you can follow the gathered stitch to make the stitch in a straight line. Stem stitch. You can even make chain stitch. You can make fly stitch in a line. You can make feather stitch. You can see the difference between cable stitch and stem stitch. These stitches are almost always made in the outline of the whatever pattern we are going to make. Just go below. When you come to the end of the line, you go below and knot it up. Wherever the thread gets over, you can knot it up. Next I am going to show you chevron stitch. How chevron stitch is applied in smocking. Supposing you are going to start from this petal, pull the thread out from the next, in between the next petal. Take a stitch in the previous pleat. Cut pannilama thambi. I am going to show you chevron stitch, how chevron stitch is made in smocking. If we are going to do the stitch in this petal, you have to bring the thread from in between the first one and the second one. Take a stitch in the first petal, take a stitch in the first pleat, another stitch in the second pleat. You get a straight stitch. Now just in the same pleat, go just below and take a stitch in the same pleat, a stitch in the next pleat, take a stitch in the same pleat and a stitch in the next pleat. Now you can see the chevron stitch forming. Take a stitch in the same pleat, close the stitch in the next pleat, take a stitch in the same pleat, another stitch in the next pleat, take a stitch in the same pleat, another stitch in the next pleat, now take a stitch in the next pleat, on top in the same pleat, stitch in the next pleat, same pleat just below the previous one, next pleat, same pleat, next pleat, same pleat, next pleat, same pleat, next pleat, same pleat, next pleat, when I say take a stitch in the next pleat, do not go deep down and take the total pleat. You just have to take a small stitch on top of the pleat. Take a small stitch on top of the pleat. You can have the dark green shade, the shaded line as the marker. So there is no chance of going in a diagonal line. You can maintain the straight line. When you come to the end of the row or when you run short of thread, just finish one chevron stitch, just go down in between the two pleats. you can see the chevron stitch. Next I will show you Van Dyke stitch. Van Dyke stitch is a very easy stitch, almost similar to the chevron stitch. Just start from in between two pleats. Take a stitch in the first petal. Take a stitch in the next petal, just one step below in the next petal, and another one step below in the next pleat. Next I am going to show you Van Dyke stitch. Start from in between two pleats. Take a stitch in the first pleat, just one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, in the next same in the same length in the next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, one step above in the next pleat. We get a V shape. Now in the same length, take a stitch in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat. Now in the same length next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, in the same length next pleat, one step below next pleat, one step below next pleat, one step below next pleat. We are bringing 3 steps down. Same length next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above next pleat, the same length next pleat. Once you come to the end of the line, or you run short of thread, you just go down in between the pleats. The same way, continue in the reverse. Continuation of the same stitch. Start here. continuation of the same stitch. We start just below the previous stitch, take a stitch in the first pleat, same in the next pleat, take a stitch one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, one step below in the next pleat, same length next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, one step above in the next pleat, same length next pleat, one step below next pleat, one step below next pleat, one step below next pleat, same length next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above next pleat, one step above next pleat. You can see the Van Dyke stitch getting connected. You have done 2 rows, but it looks like one set of pattern. One step below next pleat, one step below next pleat, one step below next pleat, same length next pleat, Van Dyke stitch. You can see cable stitch, chevron stitch, chevron stitch again in a continuous. It looks like Van Dyke stitch, but chevron stitch has been done continuously for 4 rows. Again chevron stitch, cable stitch. This is a completed smocked frock. The smocking has been done here and the strap had been fitted. The gathers in the sides. Cable stitch, chevron stitch, wave stitch, again cable stitch, after completing the embroidery, we have to remove the running stitch which we did to gather the dots. After removing the running stitch, the basic thread, the completed smocked piece looks like this. This is called honeycomb stitch, in which I have used only chevron stitch. The finished piece looks like this. You can see the gathers. It has an elastic effect. After which the frock is stitched and completed. This is a smocked frock. You can see Van Dyke stitch being done. This is Van Dyke stitch and bullion roses bullion stitches in between. Self color or contrast color. In this marking, only straight stitches have been done. And bullion stitches done in the center. You can see straight stitches. Just gather them close together and then bullion stitch.